Welcome, everyone, to the Real News Network. My name is Maximilian Alvarez. I'm the editor-in-chief here at the Real News, and it's so great to have you all with us. We are recording this on Monday, January 8th, and it has been exactly 3 months since the October 7th Hamas-led attacks in southern Israel, designated as Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, culminated in the brutal killing of over 1,100 people, including nearly 700 Israeli civilians, hundreds of security forces, and dozens of foreigners. Hamas forces also captured around 250 hostages from Israel during the attack. Since then, over the past 3 months, Israel's scorched earth assault on the Gaza Strip has wreaked a kind of devastation unseen in the 21st century. According to Gaza's health ministry, nearly 23,000 Palestinians have now been killed in Gaza since October 7th, the majority of whom are women and children, with countless others still buried under the rubble. As of December, 1.9 million people, 85% of Gaza's population, had been displaced. That number is now even higher. This is to say nothing of the violence, death, devastation, and displacement that has resulted over 75 years of Israel's brutal occupation of Palestine. Under the manifestly false guise of eradicating Hamas, Israeli forces are carrying out Israel's long-sought-after goal of eradicating Palestinians from Gaza itself, obliterating civilian lives, homes, and neighborhoods with genocidal abandon, bombing hospitals, schools, archaeological and cultural sites, refugee camps, and the infrastructure of daily life. Roads, bridges, waterways, everything. Gaza is being reduced to a moonscape. A full-scale ethnic cleansing is happening before our eyes. And the United States and President Joe Biden's administration are undeniably guilty of being full-throated accomplices, allies, and enablers of this carnage, even though Biden himself, his cabinet, and the various administrators of the United States' global military regime have tried to paint themselves as mere concerned observers on the sidelines. But make no mistake, as we speak, over on Capitol Hill, tensions are running high and fears are mounting that Israel's war on Gaza could spiral into a regional war in which the U.S. will be directly implicated. As Jason Burke writes this week in The Guardian, quote, Israeli defense officials and former senior intelligence officers have said they expect fighting in Gaza to continue for at least a year, raising the prospect of thousands more civilian casualties, a deepening humanitarian crisis, and a continuing grave threat to regional stability, end quote. Even at the New York Times, whose reporting on this issue has been, let's say, at times suspect, the concern is palpable. In a report published last week, Eric Schmidt, Julian E. Barnes, Helene Cooper, and David E. Sanger write, quote, American, Israeli, and Lebanese officials insist that few parties want Israel's war in Gaza to become a wider conflict that engulfs the Middle East. But the assassination of Saleh al-Aruri, a top leader of Hamas in Lebanon, on Tuesday, and the deaths of scores of people in mysterious twin explosions in Iran on Wednesday threatened to bring the Middle East and the United States closer to the brink of a regional war, which the Biden administration has tried to stave off since Hamas's deadly attacks against Israel on October 7th. Just hours after the bombs went off in Iran, the United States and 12 of its allies issued a written warning to another militia group in the region, the Houthis of Yemen, who have been mounting near-daily missile, drone, and seaborne attacks on commercial vessels. So far, the United States has held back from retaliating against Houthi bases in Yemen, in large part because it does not want to undermine a fragile truce in Yemen's civil war. Israeli officials would not comment on whether their forces had targeted Mr. al-Aruri, but Lebanese and American officials ascribed the attack to Israel, end quote. So what are the chances of Israel's war on Gaza spiraling into a larger regional war? And what position will that put the United States in? What would such a war look like? And what are the global implications here? What are the guardrails, for lack of a better word, currently keeping that reality at bay, and how close are those guardrails from breaking down right now? To talk about all of this, I'm honored to be joined today by my Real News colleague and host of the Chris Hedges Report, the one and only Chris Hedges. Chris, thanks so much for joining me today, man. Well, first, let me just say for the record, since we don't often get to do this on the Real News, where you and I get to chat to each other, I am just immensely proud and grateful for the incredible work that you've been doing on the Chris Hedges Report. And I'm grateful to the whole team in the back room, Kayla, the studio team, David, Cameron, Adam, everyone who's made this show a reality. It's really, really important, powerful, and we really appreciate the work you're doing here, man. And I know that you've been running yourself ragged covering this, not just since October 7th, but for, most of your adult life. And so I often find myself wondering what you think about these big issues that we're trying to cover here at the Real News every week. And this is one that I really wanted to not just have us talk about by the coffee machine in between your recordings. I wanted us to sit down and talk for our audience about how likely a regional war is here. I don't want us to try to predict the future. We can't do that. Things may change by the time this video gets released. But I wanted to just start by sort of getting your general thoughts on, where we are right now. How concerned should regular people be that this, war on Gaza, which is horrific in and of itself, that it is enough to want to stop this war on Gaza. And it shouldn't take a larger regional war for people to finally be concerned about what's happening over there. But, given where we are right now, I wanted to just ask you, from your vantage point, how close are we to this war in Gaza spiraling into a larger regional conflict?
At this particular moment, I don't think we're that close. And that's because Iran in particular, but also Hezbollah, do not want a conflict with Israel. They're not logistically prepared, in particular Hezbollah. One of the reasons Israel has bombed more than once the airports in Damascus and Aleppo is because that's the supply route to Hezbollah. Hezbollah, the Shiite militia in Lebanon, is funded and backed by Iran. But all that said, the longer the conflict goes on in Gaza, the more things can spiral out of control. If you go back and read Barbara Tuchman, for instance, most of the people, with maybe the exception of Kaiser Wilhelm, did not want World War I. But events, unfortunately, once you open that Pandora's box of war, have the ability to drive you rather than you driving it. So the longer it goes on, the more we flirt with that possibility. I think striking the Houthis is probably, if they continue attacks on shipping, I think we will see U.S. strikes on Houthi bases in Yemen. This is what was done when there was all that problem with pirating Somali pirates. If you remember, they started striking the bases. But it could happen, and if it does, it will be absolutely catastrophic, because a war with Iran throughout the region will not be interpreted as simply a war with Iran. It will be interpreted as a war against Shiism, and 60% of Iraq is Shia. Bahrain, 3 million Shias in Saudi Arabia. So it will be interpreted by the Shiites, as a religious war, and will immediately extend beyond the borders of Iran itself. The big question in Gaza, we know what the Israeli goal is. Whether they can achieve it or not is an unknown. They want to push the 2.3 million Palestinians out. They want them ethnically cleansed. That's why they're destroying the infrastructure. That's why they're engineering a humanitarian crisis. 500,000 Gazans, Palestinians in Gaza, according to the UN, are literally starving. We are already seeing huge rates of intestinal diseases, especially among children. Pretty soon you're going to see cholera. and so, and many people are living in, it's winter, so it's cold, it's rainy. So you're really, the goal of Israel is to offer the Palestinians a choice between death by bombs, bullets, infectious diseases, or exposure, or leaving Gaza. Now, the problem that Israel has run into, although Anthony Blinken tried to run interference, is that none of the countries, especially Egypt, which borders Gaza to the south, is willing to accept the Palestinians. And Blinken's first trip throughout the Middle East, he was roundly rebuffed by King Abdullah in Jordan, everywhere else, because he apparently was carrying a kind of quota list, 1.1 million Palestinians in Egypt, 700,000 in Iraq, this kind of stuff, which was just rejected throughout the Arab world. And now we know, and this has been public, by the Netanyahu government, they are reaching out to countries in Africa and South America to take the Palestinians and offering them, reportedly, financial inducements to do so. Can that be achieved? I think we don't know. At some point, despite the very, I would say, largely successful resistance put up by Hamas and other resistance groups, there are actually 12 in Gaza, they're going to run out of ammunition. I mean, they don't have the logistical supply chain to continue this forever. So that's the big conundrum. I think that we will continue to see both Hezbollah and Iran act with considerable restraint. Of course, we hear about the Houthis as being Iranian-backed. That's true up to a point, but I don't think the Iranians are in any way directing the attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, which I've crossed in a dhow. It's very big. It's about the size of California. We're talking about a very large water body. But yes, it's as with any of these conflicts, there are just so many ways it can spiral out of control so quickly, despite whatever the intentions are within the region. But I think what you're seeing with Israeli strikes against Hamas leaders, Hezbollah commanders, drone strikes, these targeted assassinations, Netanyahu and his government is counting on that restraint to prevent a wider conflict. I read the New York Times this morning. It was kind of remarkable front page story about all of the provocations that were being carried out by Iran. In fact, it's the complete opposite. The provocations are carried out by Israel, and the nation that has exercised up until this point considerable restraint is Iran.
Well, and so I'm going to ask a question that's going to sound very boilerplate and dumb, but it's one that I know is on a lot of people's minds, especially people who have been so underserved by corporate media for many years and not given the context to understand what we're actually seeing right now. But I think for your average person, when you see, Israel targeted a suburb in Lebanon and assassinates someone, doesn't that start a war? How the hell does that not spiral over into something? And so you're right. It's bonkers to read places like the New York Times, who I cited in the introduction here, and have them talking about the provocations from Iran. I'm like, Israel's assassinating people in their own countries. How is that not a provocation? And so I guess the very obvious question for people who are trying to understand this is there's been a lot of talk about the rest of the Arab world and why aren't people coming to Palestinians' aid, or why aren't these other countries willing to accept all of these displaced Palestinians from Gaza and beyond. And so that's my question, is just from a basic sort of general audience standpoint, where is that restraint coming from? What is keeping these other countries from getting more involved, even as Israel flagrantly violates international law, including in their own countries?
Well, in the case of Iran and Hezbollah, it's the fact that they don't want to go into an open conflict with Israel, because that will also probably, in the case of Iran, include a direct conflict with the United States. Netanyahu has long wanted to attack Iran, in particular the nuclear sites in Iran. And he has periodically made pushes to get the United States involved. That has been fiercely resisted by the Pentagon. Iran is not Lebanon. It's a large country, 60 million people. It virtually controls Iraq, courtesy of our disastrous invasion and occupation. So it's not an easy entity to take on. It has apparently very sophisticated aerial defense systems, and that's why Israel is unable to attack Iran by itself. It would just bring down too many warplanes. So the push by Netanyahu is to get the United States to take out the aerial defense systems and then allow Israeli jets to bomb, in particular, nuclear sites. But if they bomb those sites, we're talking about thousands and thousands of deaths, Iranian deaths. In terms of the other Arab countries, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, there's a real hostility towards Hamas because Hamas comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Sisi, of course, overthrew a Muslim Brotherhood government and has instituted very harsh measures, repression against the Muslim Brotherhood, jailing thousands of them, carrying out assassinations itself, torture, along with dissidents and all sorts. So, in fact, the Egyptian government works fairly closely, especially Egyptian intelligence, with Israeli intelligence. And they don't want Hamas, number one, to cross over the border into the sun. I mean, I will say for Sisi, the president of Egypt, he makes the point that if the Israelis want to move the Palestinians out of Gaza, which is being carpet bombed, into the desert instead of putting them in the Sinai, which is neither want to put them in the Negev, which is in Israel. But of course, the idea is to push them out and they'll never return. And the same is true with Jordan. There's the Jordanian regime is also very hostile to the Brotherhood and to Hamas. You've actually had the Jordanian army move up to the border with the West Bank to make sure the Israelis do not expel people into Jordan. Saudi Arabia is so traditionally the Arab regimes have paid lip service to the plight of the Palestinians, but done very, very little to help them. That's a long history going on for 75 years back to the founding of the State of Israel. That's not changed. So the Palestinians, I mean, I will say, with the exception of the Houthis, who have actually been proactive in defense, both in terms of trying to fire missiles and make them to Israel itself and attacking shipping, the Arab regimes have done nothing other than rhetorical calls for ceasefires. But there's always been that hypocrisy within the Arab world towards the Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it is wild to see. Out of all the people in all the countries in the region, knowing what Yemen has been through, that these are the guys who are out on these boats, actually taking the most concerted steps to try to stop this genocidal violence and disrupt it however they can. I mean, I wanted to just kind of build on that for a second. And ask the question that I brought up in the intro, right? Which is like, what would it take for these sort of guardrails that you've laid out, these sort of reasons and justifications for avoiding at all costs this boiling over into a larger regional conflict in which Iran, U.S., and others are implicated? What would it take for those guardrails to break down? How bad, if people are watching this and saying, how bad does it have to get for other countries to get involved? I guess, what would you say in response?
Well, I would say constant provocations, in a sense, repeated assassinations of Hezbollah leaders, a bombing of southern Lebanon. I mean, we already have artillery duels, but I mean, severe Israeli strikes against either the leadership of Hezbollah or the use of Israeli warplanes to begin to especially target areas in Beirut. there would come a point in which Hezbollah would not have a choice, but it would clearly be driven by Israeli actions, because Hezbollah, since the beginning of this conflict, has shown a deep reluctance to put. They have fired across the border, and there have been thousands of Israelis who have had to evacuate the northern part of Israel. But we have to remember that Hezbollah has about 150,000. People don't know, 100, 150,000 serious rockets that could do tremendous damage if they landed in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. So if they wanted to truly do damage, they could, and they haven't. They've been very, very restrained. But I think that the longer Israel carries out these kinds of strikes, the more those provocations take place, the closer we come, despite a reluctance on the part of Iran and Hezbollah, the closer we come to a regional conflict, which, it probably would start with clashes with Hezbollah. Iran does supply Hezbollah. Does Israel or the United States attack those supply lines? Is that considered by Iran to be a direct strike on Iran? This could go bad in many, many ways. But I would say it would probably begin with Hezbollah just being pushed over the edge by Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as a great poet once said, things fall apart, right? I mean, like, you could have all this restraint. You could have these different, respective reasons for avoiding, like a larger regional conflict. But I think, yeah, as you rightly pointed out, the more that this kind of violence goes on, the more that these provocations, the more that Israel feels empowered to effectively do whatever the hell it wants without anyone stopping them, the more that reckless evil of war that you've written about and documented over the course of your life, like you said, the Pandora's box is opened and no one necessarily knows where it's going to go from there. And so, like I said, I know we got to round out in a second. I don't want us to try to predict the future, which is very unpredictable at this point. But I think, like, again, another question that folks, that's on folks' mind, that is being kind of prodded and poked by, that sort of like orgiastic mainstream coverage where they talk about, like, here's the scenario that will lead to nuclear arms being used, right? Or U.S. forces being used. So, like, we are getting questions from folks of, like, what would happen? What would it take for, like, more U.S. troops to be involved in this? Or, like, how possible are nuclear weapons, things like that. So I guess I just wanted to ask if, like, you had any final thoughts on that for folks who are watching this. They're scared. They're being even more scared by mainstream media, like, I guess, about what that falling apart could look like in this case.
Well, apparently the U.S. has told Israel that if they carry out a ground incursion into southern Lebanon, they will not get involved. They said that if Hezbollah carried out a ground incursion into Israel, which is highly unlikely, that would be a different matter. In terms of Iran, I think that Iran would have to be actively, which it has not been, actively engaged in carrying out strikes against, which I find unlikely, against either Israeli or U.S. targets. And at that point, then we're in deep, deep trouble. So again, I think if the match is lit, it's lit in Lebanon. And the Israeli leadership has talked about this as an axis of, they've stolen this Bush term, axis of evil, that it's not just a war with the Palestinians, although I don't know how you can have a war with a people that doesn't have an army, a navy, an air force, artillery, mechanized units, anything else. So they're already speaking in that apocalyptic rhetoric, I think in the end it's really totally dependent on how far Israel goes, and if they do not show restraint, then I could see it beginning with Hezbollah, and once Hezbollah is actively engaged, especially if Israel does make a ground incursion into Lebanon, then you bring Iran a few steps closer to being involved in a conflict. Then at that point, it becomes a regional conflict and very, very dangerous.
Well, and like, since you mentioned Bush, I just kind of want to close on this question. And this should be reserved for a larger discussion, but just like a kind of rounding out question in terms of asking about like the current guardrails that are keeping us from spiraling out into a larger regional war. Like, I'm wondering what role like internal pressure here in the United States and public sentiment against the war or for a ceasefire, and just the general lack of desire to get embroiled in such a regional war, what role, if any, that plays. Because like, I've been thinking a lot about this, and you and I were talking about this before we got recording, right? Like, I've been very upfront on my show, on the Real News and elsewhere, that like I grew up in many ways a typical first-gen Mexican-American family. We were raised with that type of conservatism. We did it the right way. We were in the land of opportunity, yada, yada, yada. And after 9/11, when I was still young and dumb, like, I bought in fully to the sort of jingoistic fervor. I remember when names like yours came up on Fox News, I'll be like, oh, who are those nut jobs, right? Like, those guys, they're unpatriotic, right? And that was like, I think a lot of people forget just like how dominant that culture was and that feeling was for so many people. That's not to negate the tremendous outpourings of demonstrators and brave voices like you're speaking out against the disastrous war in Iraq and everything the Bush administration was doing. But I just keep thinking about how drastically the public mood has changed in 20 years, where you had so many families like mine, regular people, working people who lived in the heart of empire and still felt that imperial hubris, like we had the right to go around telling the rest of the world how to run their countries, right? And that we were never going to suffer any consequences for that. And now you just have like quite a sea change, at least in terms of the public opinion about how involved the U.S. should be in this or any other war. At the same time, though, the resistance from the upper echelons of power, in the same way that Bush and Blair could look at these historic outpourings of people and in the most cynical way use those as justifications for the war and say like, oh, you see all those people out there protesting? That's why the terrorists want to attack us, because they hate our freedom. So that's why we're going to go and invade Iraq. Like, it was one of the most cynical things I've ever seen in my life. But like, again, right now, as far as Biden, Blinken, and their administration are concerned, like, they seem just as willfully deaf to the opposition to Israel's war on Gaza and the U.S. getting involved in more foreign wars. Do you see that playing like any real role in stopping this? Or at this point, has power just found a way to successfully inoculate itself from the demos completely?
Yeah. I mean, look, the Congress is bought and paid for by the Israel lobby. Biden is one of the largest recipients of Israel lobby aid. Both parties are completely wedded to Israel. Our intelligence services are integrated with the Israelis. Israel is the 10th largest arms exporter in the world, so it's training our police forces. So I think, especially because it's Israel, it doesn't really matter what the public and all these demonstrations, which have been very heartening to people like myself, it doesn't matter. Especially, it's worse because it's Israel. So if somehow there began to be a conflict between Iran and Israel, I have little doubt that we would intervene. And at that point, we're at war with Iran.
Well, that is the great Chris Hedges, host of the Chris Hedges Report, which you can watch every week, every Friday, noon Eastern time, right here on the Real News Network. You can also subscribe to Chris's Substack, which I highly encourage everyone to do if you want early access to those episodes. Chris, thank you so much for talking to me about this, man, and thank you for all the incredible work that you're doing.
Thanks, Max.
And thank you all so much for watching. Thank you for caring. Please take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Solidarity forever. Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.
Welcome to PPR Global. The Middle East continues to be the center of the rivalry between Israel and Iran. In retaliation for the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, the Tehran regime for the first time directly targeted Israeli territory with more than 300 missiles and drones. Israel managed to shoot down almost all of these missiles and drones. The Israeli Air Force then launched counterstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear energy facility in Isfahan and the Revolutionary Guards Corps' military airbase. So far, these have been the mutual responses we have all been waiting for. But what is important is what happens now, and what is really going to happen between Iran and Israel in the Middle East. Which weapons and defense systems of Israel and Iran will be activated in the event of an attack by either side? In fact, Israel has recently taken a shocking step in this regard. The information that the Israeli army has activated the secret laser weapon system against possible airstrikes by Iran or pro-Iranian armed elements and will actively use it against its enemies in the region has created a shock effect on the agenda. So what is this secret system? We are talking about Israel's secret high-powered laser rocket interception system, also known as Iron Beam. It is known that this system is currently being used for the Gaza Strip. The head of Rafael, the company that developed the system, confirmed that Israel has been deploying Iron Beam, Israel's high-powered laser-guided rocket interceptor, on the Gaza front in recent months. There is now an idea to deploy it close to Israel's borders facing Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Due to the Jordanian borderline and King Abdullah's approach to support Israel against Iran, the Iron Beam system is expected to be more active in areas close to the Syrian and Lebanese borderlines. In this way, the Israeli armed forces will field another powerful defense system such as Iron Beam, in addition to the Iron Dome, David's sling and arrow systems against Iran, and pro-Iranian armed elements. Iron Beam, which is currently used for the Gaza Strip, was tested in 2022. During this test, a drone was flown in the coverage area of the system. A beam of light was then fired at the drone, cutting its wing and causing it to fall to the ground. After the test, Brigadier General Dr. Gold, who heads the Defense Research and Development Directorate in Israel's Defense Ministry, said that Iron Dome was 90% successful in stopping incoming attacks. The lower cost of the Iron Beam defense system compared to other systems also attracted attention. Naftali Bennett, Israel's former prime minister, estimated that in 2022, each Iron Beam interception would cost about $2. But Dr. Gold explained that the cost of each missile fired by Iron Dome is about $100,000, while firing with light costs nothing. The new laser system is expected to work with it and at a lower cost, but it only works when the skies are clear. Still, this defense system is on its way to becoming a turning point for Israel. Iron Beam's more effective and less costly protection of Israel against rocket and other airstrikes by pro-Iranian armed elements such as Hamas and Hezbollah has greatly influenced the course of the war, especially as the war in the north draws closer, and with the threat of 160,000 Hezbollah rockets being directed at Tel Aviv, having Iron Beam in the field is a great relief to Israel. In order to analyze the benefits of the Iron Beam defense system for Israel, we need to address the technical specifications of the system. In fact, Dr. Gold explained that Iron Dome is only part of the shield that currently covers Israel. The system sits below David's sling, which is designed to destroy enemy aircraft and medium to long-range rockets fired from 200 miles away, and Arrow 2 and Arrow 3, which protect Israel from ballistic missiles fired from Iran. Capable of remotely neutralizing rockets, missiles, or drones at zero cost compared to Iron Dome, the laser system automatically activates itself when a launch is detected. The system is designed to destroy short-range rockets, artillery, and air cannon with a range of up to 7 kilometers. Iron Beam uses a fiber laser to destroy the airborne target within 4-5 seconds after firing. Whether acting as a standalone system or with external marking as part of an air defense system, the threat is detected by a surveillance system and tracked by vehicle platforms to engage. The Iron Beam battery is mobile and consists of an air defense radar, a command and control unit, and 2 high-energy laser systems. The system is based on 5 years of research and development in solid-state lasers and has been developed by Rafael, funded by the MOD, and extensively insured by the United States. The United States recently announced its latest aid to Israel. The newly announced bill, signed by President Joe Biden, includes funding for Israel to purchase a directed energy system called Iron Beam. According to a summary of the legislation, the Israel Security Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2024 consists of a total of $26.4 billion to support Israel in its efforts to defend itself against Iran and its proxies and to reimburse U.S. military operations in response to recent attacks. According to the text of the bill, $1.2 billion of this amount is earmarked for the Secretary of Defense to provide to the Israeli government for the procurement and subsequent transfer of the Iron Beam. The $1.2 billion allocated by the U.S. Congress for Iron Beam will remain available until September 30th, 2026. The U.S. is seriously excited about this system. In fact, Doug Bush, Chief of Procurement for the U.S. Army, suggested last fall that the Pentagon might consider procuring Iron Beam in the future. In a roundtable discussion with journalists at the Pentagon, Doug Bush said he was pleased to see Iron Beam investment in the original supplemental request put forward by the White House. Mr. Bush also noted that the U.S. military has energy systems in the works, including the Indirect Fire Protection Capability High Energy Laser Prototype Program, overseen by the Army's Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office. With these statements, Doug Bush, the Chief Acquisition Officer of the U.S. Army, indicated that he sees the Iron Beam system as a complement to his country's military air defense systems. So Israel's Iron Beam system is also on the U.S. agenda. This is likely to intimidate Iran considerably, because even if Iran launches hundreds of rockets and drones into Israeli territory, the possibility that the IDF's Iron Beam air defense system can eliminate all of these targets costlessly could change the Tehran regime's war strategies in the Middle East. Once Israel has thwarted any potential Iranian airstrikes, it could respond very harshly. We have already witnessed this in the last Israeli airstrike on Iran. Israel's move could also bring Iran much closer to Russia. This is because Israel, with the help of the United States, has put an incredible system like the Iron Beam on the battlefield, pushing Tehran to look for other options. Iran will therefore demand more military support from Russia. It is interesting to note that despite the presence of the Russian S-300 air defense system on Iranian territory, the Israeli strikes targeted Isfahan and bypassed the Russian S-300 system at the military base in that city. Russia is well aware that Israeli missiles can penetrate Iranian air defense systems. But the question is whether Russia will be more supportive of Iran in this regard. If Putin chooses to leave Iran alone in the region, Israel can effectively and comfortably counter the aggressive policies of Iran and pro-Iranian armed elements in the Middle East. We will see the regional effects of polarization much more clearly in the time to come. Thank you for following us.
The president of Turkey, President Erdogan, has said that the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, will be tried as a war criminal. Goodness. He has been speaking in the last few moments, and he has said that the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, will be tried as a war criminal.
There's a church in the city of Bethlehem. It was built on the spot where Christians believe Jesus was born. It's called the Church of the Nativity. If you consult UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites or ask travel expert Rick Steves, both will tell you that the church is in Palestine. But when a question about the church's location came up during a round of Jeopardy in January 2020...
Built in the 300s AD, the Church of the Nativity.
What is Palestine?
No.
What is Israel?
That's it.
That answer set off something of an internet firestorm. That's because what you call this land, and who controls it, is at the center of a decades-long conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. But more recently, there is also a third group that is becoming more and more influential here and throughout the Middle East: American evangelical Christians. Today, evangelical Christians are one of the most politically powerful voting blocs in the United States. And in the Trump administration, they've been given unprecedented power. They've turned support for Israel and hostility towards its enemies into core tenets of conservative ideology. And a big part of those policies is rooted in how they interpret the Bible. In 2016, more than a quarter of all U.S. voters identified as white evangelical Christians. One of the primary differences between evangelicals and other Christians is their relationship with the Bible.
Conservative evangelicals believe that the Bible is literally true.
Sarah Posner writes about religion for a bunch of different publications.
Many of them believe that the Bible is sort of this prophetic roadmap for modern life, that events described and prophesied in the Bible will become true.
The Bible is the most historically accurate book ever penned.
The Bible is the one book that dares to predict the future with 100% accuracy.
For evangelicals, the most important of the Bible's prophecies is the second coming, when Jesus will return to earth. The Bible doesn't say when this will happen, but it does say where.
This is Jerusalem. World history as we know it is going to end right here.
Greg Laurie is an evangelical preacher, one of several who meet regularly to advise President Trump. They are the leaders of megachurches with tens of thousands of members. And many of them, including Greg Laurie, preach a belief called Christian Zionism, the idea that the return of the Jewish people to Israel is one of a series of events that will trigger Jesus' second coming.
Jesus is telling us that the rebirth of Israel is a sign of the end, not just a sign, it's the super sign.
According to this theology, God will reward those who help Israel and punish those who don't.
Jesus will be on his throne and he separates the nations. On what basis? How they treated Zion.
Let's back up. After the Holocaust, the UN divided up the then British territory of Palestine, home to more than 1 million Arabs, into 2 states, giving Jews who had been persecuted in Europe a homeland. Over the next few decades, Israel fought multiple wars with its Arab neighbors and seized much of the land that had been originally set aside for Palestinians. Evangelical Christians see that as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
It happened exactly as foretold. It was a miraculous act of God.
They own that land and they own that city.
Ever since, groups like Hamas have been fighting against the Israelis, trying to win that territory back. And the government of Iran has been one of their biggest supporters. That's part of the reason Iran plays such an important role in evangelical beliefs about the present state of the world and the future. According to Christian Zionism, if the U.S. wants to be on the right side of biblical prophecy, they need to do everything possible to protect Israel and punish Iran. That also helps explain why a different Bible story is also really important to them. The Old Testament story of Esther, about a plot to destroy the Jews of Persia, or modern-day Iran. The Book of Esther plays such an important role for Christian Zionists, they've made multiple movies out of it.
He has convinced your husband to destroy all the Jews, including you.
Esther saves the Jews by using her persuasion with the king. Evangelicals who are very wrapped up in this kind of theology, because Persia is modern-day Iran, they sort of contextualize this Bible story into foreign policies.
Could it be that President Trump right now has been sort of raised for such a time as this, just like Queen Esther, to help save the Jewish people from an Iranian menace?
As a Christian, I certainly believe that's possible. I'm confident that the Lord is at work here.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Vice President Mike Pence both identify as evangelical Christians, and both have enormous influence over American foreign policy. A ProPublica investigation found that Pence routed millions of dollars in foreign aid that had been earmarked for humanitarian projects in Iraq, diverting it towards Christian groups in the country. When President Trump approved the drone strike that killed Iran's top military commander in January 2020, it was, according to the Washington Post, at Pompeo and Pence's urging. When President Trump moved the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the move had more support from American evangelicals than American Jews.
The other news swirling around the embassy's move to Jerusalem is what it could signal as part of biblical prophecy.
Donald Trump recognized history. He, like King Cyrus before him, fulfilled the biblical prophecy.
That evangelical support isn't an accident. The Trump administration courts it. After the administration put out a peace plan that would have given Israel unprecedented control over Palestinian land, the Christian Broadcast Network interviewed Trump's ambassador to Israel.
You're talking about opening up the Bible, bringing it back to life in ways that I think your listeners could not have even have imagined. It's an opportunity for biblical tourism that I think will grow and flourish in profound ways.
The network's coverage followed his lead.
Good news in this proposed peace plan. Israel would have sovereignty over many historical biblical sites.
For evangelical Christians in America, the Bible isn't just a foundational text. It's a prophetic roadmap that tells the future and shapes the way they view the present. And for an influential group of them, that motivates their support for a foreign policy that they see as affirming those prophecies, and a president who depends on their votes.
Over the last 8 years, we've heard you talk about the former president. You have called him a fraud, a con artist. You've said he's a New Yorker like you, and you have watched this brand of BS for decades. And despite that, he became president. And now we're watching him, 10 blocks from where we are right now, sitting in a courtroom as a criminal defendant. What do you think about that?
I think of how absurd it is. And this might be the one case where that could be it for him. It's a state case. It's the least important in many ways, and yet it's the one that could be tried and finished in well enough time for people to just take that in.
Does it give you some sense, not of joy, but of relief at least, that he's potentially facing some consequences? Because as you've said before, this guy's a con artist and he's gotten away with it for years.
No, he's more than that to me. He's sick. He is really, genuinely a sick person that somehow has been allowed into our system. And I'm not calling him, I'm tired of calling him names. He just can't be anywhere near the office of the presidency.
You've played a lot of bad guys. Would you ever play Donald Trump?
Never. There's nothing about him. There's not one redeeming thing in him that I can see ever. And it's funny, I was just thinking that he actually became president. He could have done good things. Instead, he had to do it all wrong. He's so, as we all know, so narcissistic and self-centered.
What do you say to those who say, I don't like the guy, but I'm going to vote for him? What's your message to them?
I don't understand it. I don't think they understand how dangerous it will be if he ever, God forbid, becomes president. I don't think they really understand. And historically, from what I see, even in Nazi Germany, they had it with Hitler. They don't take him serious. He looks like a clown, acts like a clown. Mussolini, same thing. These guys, I don't know why, they look like clowns. They somehow, people, that element of society identifies in some ways with them, but it would be chaos beyond our imagination. There's no mystery about him. He's right out front, and what he says is what it'll be if he becomes president.
Do you think our democracy is at risk in this election?
I think that it is. I always keep saying democracy is great, of course. But democracy people take for granted. It's a word that some people don't even understand. They take it for granted. It's about right and wrong, period. The guy's a monster. It's beyond wrong. It's almost like he wants to do the most horrible things that he can think of in order to get a rise out of us. I don't know what it is, but he's been doing it, and it's scary.
Are you
Excuse my French.
Do you have any concerns for the future of the arts if you were to become president? He has already said he wants to go after his enemies. He wants to go after journalists and the news media. What about your industry?
I believe he will. The only thing that I would think is that what'll happen is that he'll go after these things like he always impulsively, and he'll be stopped. There'll be pushback, a lot of it, and there might be as much pushback as needed, like in the streets, conflict that could happen, civil strife, because but he will try it.
You have no upside in having this conversation, in speaking out against Donald Trump. You are making yourself a target. The interview will air, and he will immediately find a reason to talk bad about you in public.
Yeah.
But you're choosing to use your platform to do so. What do you say to other celebrities who don't want to alienate part of their fan base, don't want to step in harm's way, but they have similar megaphones that you do?
You know, the idea to be bullied at my age by someone like this is not happening.
I'm pretty sure you were never bullied.
No, there was a kid sometime this, that, but the point is not, and for the country, no. And I think other people are going to have to stand up and just, because it's either that or you're going to find yourself in a situation that's so terrifying. We always hear about people from Eastern Europe, the Jews from other parts of Eastern Europe, from Western Europe, coming over. Look what happened in France with the Nazis and so on. And they come over, and you hear these, and when I was a kid, they'd say, "You don't really appreciate this country. You don't really appreciate what we know from experience." Imagine what those people went through. I'm just starting to see it. You know, as a kid, I said, Hitler, it's a nightmare that never would happen. But now I see that it's possible. And what those people, and sometimes I run into some people who are close to my age who are from Eastern Europe, European countries, or even Nazi Germany, and you understand it.
Did you ever care this much about politics?
No, I don't. I mean, I'm sort of not indifferent, but but I'm so angry about what's going on. I don't see how it can be avoided.
Do you think Joe Biden's the right guy?
We don't have a choice. And I think he is the right guy. He's a good guy. He's trying to do the right thing. We don't have a choice. And I say that in a very positive, good way.
Then what would be your message to President Biden?
Keep up the fight. Keep at him. Go at him hard. And every chance you get, go at him. Go at him. Because people, they take notice of that stuff. And he's not afraid. He's doing what he should do. He knows that. That's the only way. I use figuratively when I say punch him in the face. Go at him. A bully, you punch in the face. The trouble with Trump is he's not just a bully. He's a stupid bully.
You warned America about who Donald Trump was in 2016. You're a lifetime New Yorker, so is he, and you said the country does not realize who this fraudster is, and not enough people listened. Do you think they'll listen now?
I hope to God they do, because they don't. If it goes the other way, I keep saying this, you will see things that, like you'll see, it's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You'll see people you knew or you thought you knew all of a sudden changing, all of a sudden going with that side, either for self-preservation, because they actually believe it, or they're deluding themselves, or whatever. But then when that happens, and you walk into a restaurant, you see people you used to know, and all of a sudden they're just not opposing it. They're going with the flow, and that's even more scary, insidious, I guess, if you say it like that, and ultimately just depressingly disappointing there has to be a time when you have to say, okay, that's it. No, we're not doing that. We're not allowing that to happen. And this is the time in this country for that to happen.
Then this moment is about decency and democracy to you?
It's decency and right and wrong, and democracy follows. You have to know how to behave in order to make the democracy work.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been the focal point of geopolitical instability in the Middle East since the establishment of Israel in 1948. Although the vast majority of the international community, the UN, and the United States publicly support a two-state solution to try and end this conflict, after decades of negotiation, the final settlement has never been reached, and tensions between the Jewish state and the Arab world continue to fester. Throughout this process, America has remained firmly behind Israel as its greatest supporter. In fact, Israel receives more U.S. foreign aid than any other country in the world. Now, much of this support has been attributed to a strong, wealthy, and very pro-Israeli lobby in America, which is true, but you'd think that the majority of the strength behind this lobby would be the Jewish community in the U.S., which is only partially correct, because as it turns out, in terms of sheer numbers, the evangelical Christians from America's Bible Belt make up the majority of this lobby's power base. So we sent Thomas Morton to find out why a bunch of born-again Christians from Texas are so in love with the nation of Israel.
This may be the most important prophetic spot in the entire Bible, because the final act of the book of Revelation is going to begin right here at this place. The Bible teaches that Russia, Iran, Ethiopia, Libya, Turkey, and other nations will come down under a UN flag, and they will invade Israel at this particular point. Can you imagine? Thousands of tanks out here in this valley, rumbling, fighting, firing. Can you imagine jet airplanes screaming overhead? The battle is going to be fierce.
The horrific multinational fighting this preacher is describing is the Battle of Armageddon, which is supposed to happen right here, just as soon as Israel is a fully Jewish state. Which is why a bunch of Christians in Texas have become the most fervent Zionists on God's green earth.
While most Americans probably think that the pro-Israeli lobby is largely a Jewish thing, actually most of its support comes from right here in the Bible Belt, where evangelical Christians overwhelmingly believe that Israel has a right to exist because God said so.
Go to the phone right now and call that number and say, yes, I'm going to stand with Israel. I'm going to bless the people of the Bible. I'm going to bless God's chosen people.
Will those of you in this audience who support the state of Israel stand to your feet and give a shout of support?
While a lot of Israel's financial support does come from Jewish wallets, there are close to 70 million evangelicals in America versus less than 14 million Jews worldwide. And given that roughly 80% of these Christians support Israel, that makes American Christians the largest pro-Israeli voting bloc in the world, about 4 times the size of the Jewish community on Earth.
There's a lot of money behind the Christian Zionist movement. This church behind me, Cornerstone, is one of the biggest supporters of Israel, not just among Christians, but in the world. The pastor here, John Hagee, has raised an estimated $70 million over the course of his ministry.
Pastor Hagee also founded Christians United for Israel, or CUFI, which is the largest pro-Israel lobbying organization in America, even bigger than AIPAC, the organization most people assume dominates the American Israel lobby because it's the biggest Jewish one. What's dicey about CUFI is that a good deal of their money for Israel is spent on buildings and organizations in the Israeli settlements. These are massive Jewish communities built well within Palestinian territory in violation of international law. The settlements are run by some of the most fanatical Zionists who believe the Bible entitles them to their land, and that ceding any of it back to the Palestinians would be a violation of God's law.
God gave them that land. They own that land.
While there's nothing wrong with Christians supporting Israel, the way these Christians have chosen to do so puts them firmly on one side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one that's directly opposed to the U.S. government's official policy. and are using their massive political power and money to oppose the peace plan John Kerry is currently trying to push through. That's the two-state solution that would give the Palestinians the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and the Israelis would get the rest, hopefully ending all the violence. The evangelicals not only lobby Washington and send money to Israel to fight the two-state solution, they also make up over 40% of American tourists in Israel every year with popular Holy Land pilgrimage tours. Many of these tours actually have stops in the Israeli settlements, which are used by the settlers to solicit donations for their cause.
We're in Karnei Shamram, Israeli settlement. We're about to meet Sandra, who deals with Pastor Hagee in the United States. She is not a Christian, she's an Orthodox Jew. And right now she's hosting a bunch of Christian Australians who are touring the settlement and hopefully coughing up the bills.
To make the settlements more relatable to their Christian friends, Sandra and her organization used the Palestinian territories' biblical names of Judea and Samaria.
It is for us as people who believe in the Bible is to stand on the moral and spiritual right of the Jewish people to Judea and Samaria. Amen? Amen. Good.
After Sandra's presentation, we reboarded the bus to see the settlement for ourselves.
Come on, guys. I want you to try to punch him in the stomach. Let's give it a try. Unfortunately, our Arab neighbors also have these kinds of guns. You need to be protected with something like this.
How important is Christian support for specifically for the settlements?
Christian support for the Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria is critical because it's a very large group of people all over the world, and we need to hear their voices, and thank God they are raising their voices on this issue louder and louder every day.
Another Christian Holy Land tour leader is evangelical pastor Irvin Baxter, whose End Time Ministries takes its flock to Israel twice a year. The focus of their tours is actually the real reason evangelicals overwhelmingly want the Jews to control all of Israel, which is the actual end times, as in Armageddon. Because, according to their interpretation of the Bible, Jewish control of the Holy Land will lead directly to the second coming of Christ.
The word Armageddon is actually two words, Har Megiddo, or Hill of Megiddo. You are standing on the Hill of Megiddo right now. The final act of the book of Revelation is going to begin right here at this place. And when Israel's about to be defeated, the Bible tells us that Jesus Christ himself will intervene. It says it this way: the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God. He is going to defeat the Antichrist. He's going to defeat the false prophet. Both of them will be cast alive into the lake of fire. At that time, Satan is going to be bound for the next 1,000 years, and we are going to crown Jesus Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Real quickly, I will take time for a few questions.
What will be happening in Maryland at that time?
Well, I can't tell you for sure if Maryland will still be there or not.
In addition to Armageddon, Pastor Baxter's End Times tour hits all the other local attractions associated with the apocalypse, including the most contested piece of real estate on the planet, Jerusalem, which houses some of the most sacred sites for Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. It's also where Jesus lands at the grand finale of the End Times, which doesn't pan out so great for the Jews.
2/3 of Israel will die. It's Zechariah 13, I think, maybe verse 7, 8, 9, right in that area.
Yeah.
That 2/3 will die. 1/3 will be brought through the fire, and that 1/3 will then turn to Messiah en masse when he comes back. And the scripture says that they will run out to him, and when they bow to worship him, Zechariah 13:6 says they're going to notice he's got wounds in his feet and in his hand. And they're going to say, "You're Jesus? Oh, Messiah, we've been so stubborn, we've been so proud, we've been so blind. Could you ever forgive us?" And 2,000 years of blindness is going to come peeling off the Jewish mind. And those of us that have been caught up in the rapture and come with Jesus here to...
Oh, because the Christians have been raptured out.
All who are born again
Yeah.
will have been raptured. When Jesus comes, we'll be caught up to meet him in the air.
Yeah.
And then we will come with him to the Mount of Olives. And so we're going to be watching this whole panoramic thing unfold as the Jewish people turn to their Messiah. We're going to be converting people by the hundreds of thousands during this time. It's going to be the best of times and the worst of times.
While the 2/3 of Jews who die are definitely getting the worst of times into the stick, it's a little less clear how the rest of the world fares in the pastor's end of days scenario. Can America get on the right side of Armageddon by supporting Israel?
Americans can let their legislators know, support Israel. Right now, under the President Obama administration, there seems to be a drift somewhat away from Israel, at least a determination to force Israel to do what America thinks it should do.
The only way for Israel to endure and thrive as a Jewish and democratic state is through the realization of an independent and viable Palestine.
The Jewish people should say, look, this is our promised land. The Bible says we should not give it up, so we're not giving it up. You have to respect our religion.
Aside from potentially derailing an otherwise pretty solid peace plan, Christian support for the Israeli settlements further makes life a pain in the ass for the Palestinians living nearby. Which is exactly what's happening at Beit Jala, a Palestinian village on the outskirts of Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. Javier Abu Aid is also Christian, as well as an official in the Palestinian Liberation Organization. We met him at a weekly outdoor mass put on by the Catholic Church as a form of protest against Israeli encroachment.
2 years ago, an Israeli court decided to build the wall here, where we are. So basically all this valley that you see here, it's going to be on the Israeli side of the wall.
Hello, how are you?
Hey, how are you? For example, he's one of the 58 landowners that are going to lose their land here. It's and are 58 Palestinian Christian families that are going to lose their land here. And you're not talking about, immigrants that came here. You're talking about indigenous population of this land. We are standing now over a territory that no one in the world, not even the US, recognizes as part of Israel.
I know a lot of evangelicals, it's really big in America right now to support Israel because they say, well, the Bible says Israel belongs to the Jews. And a lot of them also believe that once the Jews take over all of Israel, then they get to have Armageddon.
I've read the Bible, and I never saw that the Bible says that God is a real estate agent. Those Christian Zionist organizations, they are not giving money actually to the state of Israel. They are giving money to the most ideological settlers. Okay. And of course, I don't think that's a very Christian act.
If I were a Palestinian Christian, I wouldn't involve myself in this conflict. I'd stay out of it and say, look, I know what's coming. I'm going to serve Jesus Christ. When he gets here, he'll straighten all this out.
While Baxter's advice for Christians on the ground is basically just to bunker down and get ready for the inevitable, he and his fellow Christian Zionists in America are working full tilt to make the end of days a reality, and are using the voting strength of their followers to try and get Washington on their side. And in a political conflict that's already been hijacked by religious zealots on both the Palestinian and Israeli side, adding millions of doomsday-ready American evangelicals to the table is like pouring gas on the fire, in the most flammable region in the world.
The Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. לעולם לא נשכח את מעשי הזוועה שעשו לנו אויבינו. אנחנו הולמים באויבינו בעוצמה חסרת תקדים. אני מדגיש, זאת רק ההתחלה. They've made a mistake of historic proportions. We will exact a price that will be remembered by them and Israel's other enemies for decades to come.
Israel has responded with fury. Fighter jets taking aim at targets in the Palestinian territory.
More than 10,000 people have been killed since this conflict began.
كل الدار فيها 1000 واحد هنا في المنطقة كلهم استشهدوا.
As the Israel-Hamas war drags on, backlash against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is growing at home. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has heavily criticized Netanyahu.
He's the worst person to have to deal with it. I think that he is really in a nervous breakdown. A person who has portrayed himself and presented himself for many years as Mr. Security failed in the most fundamental obligation for his citizens, which is to provide them with security.
Today, Netanyahu's leadership is on the verge of imploding, deeply unpopular with his own people and under immense pressure from the international community.
La lutte doit être sans merci, mais pas sans règles.
This is a fall from grace for a man who was reportedly told by one of the most powerful Jewish religious figures in the world that he would be the one to welcome the Messiah. "40 years ago, when Netanyahu was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, he met Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the leader of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, known simply as the Rebbe.
He said, you're going to this house of darkness, the UN, which was very, very unfriendly to Israel at the time. He called it the house of darkness. And he said, even in the greatest darkness, if you light a candle, it spreads a great light that can be seen from afar.
The Rebbe reportedly believed Netanyahu had a mission from God to prepare Israel for the coming of the Messiah, or in Hebrew, the Moshiach. Over the next decade, the two men developed a close relationship. Soon after entering Israel's parliament for the first time, Netanyahu paid his respects to his mentor.
Back then, Netanyahu was probably the only ally that he could work with in Israeli politics. He obviously demands from Netanyahu to take some steps to hasten the coming of Messiah, which is to make Israel a more religious place and to take certain concrete steps in this regard. And Netanyahu says, I'm definitely doing that.
מה שרואה עוד, וגם משהו שעדיין משיח ליבו, אז הייתה מה שהוא עם מה הביאתו.
ועושים.
הכנראה שהיא מספיק, כאילו שהיום כבר כמה שעות בגלל ועדיין ליבו.
The Rebbe never visited Israel, not once, and yet from his home in Brooklyn, he was able to influence Israeli politics.
הבטיחו לי בוודאי כמה הבטחה שמכל השיחות תהיינה כל עניינים של ויתור על שטחים.
His influence was recognized by American politicians too. US presidents paid homage to him, establishing and proclaiming a National Education and Sharing Day in honor of his birthday.
And please give my warmest regards to the Rebbe on this his 86th birthday.
Menachem Mendel Schneerson was born in 1902 in the Black Sea port of Nikolaev, which was part of the Russian Empire but now part of Ukraine. He and his wife lived in Berlin and Paris before fleeing the Nazis in 1941, seeking refuge in New York, where they put down roots. A decade later, in 1951, he took over the Chabad movement from his father-in-law, who died the previous year. Menachem Schneerson revived and grew the movement for over 40 years until his death in New York in 1994. His followers in Brooklyn were devastated.
Most of them believed he would never die. They still believe Rabbi Menachem Schneerson will be physically resurrected as Mashiach, the Messiah.
A physical resurrection when he's going to come back in his full glory imminently and redeem the entire world.
Currently, the center of the Chabadic movement is in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood called Crown Heights. So it is an American movement in terms of its center, but it is also a global movement. One of the biggest purposes of Chabad is to bring those quote-unquote lost Jews back into Judaism. So Chabad has its own rabbis and emissaries appointed all around the world. It is a global movement.
Headquartered in Brooklyn, the Chabad movement has a presence in every state in America and in over 100 countries around the world, with a particularly high focus in Europe and in Israel. It has hundreds of thousands of followers, and runs synagogues, schools, drug rehabilitation centers, and care homes. On the face of it, the movement has been for the betterment of Jews around the world. But according to one analyst, its modus operandi has provided a template for a terror group.
We have good reasons to believe that Fatah got inspired from the Chabad movement. One of the high-ranking members of the Fatah movement was praising the Chabad movement in the sense that the Chabad used to send its emissaries and rabbis all around the world, just like Fatah was doing, sending out teachers to Central Asia and to Africa and to other parts of the world.
For over 40 years, the charismatic Rebbe led the movement. His $1 donations, including to Netanyahu, came with a blessing to his followers and a reminder to give to those less fortunate. A couple of years after this meeting, the Rebbe reportedly told a young Netanyahu that he would one day become Prime Minister of Israel and would be the nation's last leader before handing the scepter to the Messiah. This first part of the Rebbe's prediction came true in 1996, when a 47-year-old Benjamin Netanyahu became Prime Minister for the first time. But his government fell just 3 years later. For a while, Netanyahu withdrew from politics. The Rebbe's words faded into history until a decade later, Netanyahu became Prime Minister for a second time.
העם רוצה שינוי. העם רוצה ללכת בדרך אחרת. הדרך שלנו ניצחה. היא הדרך שתוביל את העם.
Netanyahu's second premiership lasted for over 12 years, until he was eventually ousted by his political opponents. Another setback for anyone who believed in the Rebbe's messianic prophecy. But Netanyahu was back just a few months later, forming a coalition with ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionist parties. He began his third premiership almost exactly a year ago. And it's been a tumultuous year. His hardline government has massively accelerated the construction of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, considered illegal under international law. It's also provoked massive protests by attempting to grab more power for itself at the expense of other branches of government. The protests threatened to bring down Netanyahu's government. But then, on October 7th, everything changed.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning, where Hamas has launched a surprise attack.
A massive surprise attack.
Hundreds of Hamas fighters poured across breached border points.
They attacked by air, land and sea, taking Israel by surprise.
With many in his own country blaming him for the worst security failure in Israel's history, Netanyahu is once again relying on religious language to rally the country.
The Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war.
That kind of language is recognized by evangelical Christians in the United States, who are still able to influence US policy in the Middle East.
Netanyahu took that Bible verse from Ecclesiastes 3.
Netanyahu spent many years living and working in the United States and has always believed in his ability to influence America.
אבל אנחנו הולכים למסלול התנגשות עם הממשל האמריקאי. ארצות הברית זה לא מקשה אחת, זה לא מקשה אחת. יש את הסנאט, יש את הקונגרס, יש את הכוח היהודי שהוא עצום, יותר חזק משהיה אי פעם. יש דעת קהל, יש לנו כוחות כבירים בדעת הקהל שמתנגדים למדיניות הזאת, גדולי הפרשנים. אמריקה לא תכפה לנו דבר, אם לא נפגע.
And today, his relationship with President Joe Biden may not be perfect, but that confidence, at least outwardly, is still there.
בשיחותיי עם הנשיא ביידן ועם מנהיגים אחרים בעולם, ובמאמצים רבים אחרים, אנחנו מגייסים לישראל תמיכה בינלאומית כבירה. אנחנו מבטיחים את המשך המלחמה עם עוד תחמושת שמגיעה לארץ, עוד אמצעי לחימה. אנחנו נחסל את החמאס, אנחנו נביא ניצחון.
Today, Netanyahu compares his war with Hamas to Israel's battle with the Amalek in the Old Testament.
You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember and we are fighting.
The Amalek was one of Israel's arch enemies, and in some parts of the Old Testament, God commanded they should be destroyed. Some commentators believe this is what Netanyahu is signaling with his biblical references.
Amalek is a sign of people what was evil people, and they try to take away Jewish people from God, to divide them from God and to take them away from God. He's doing the same thing what Amalek has done. He's doing what Amalek has done. So how he coming to speak in the name of the Torah, in the name of the Jewish religion, when he don't believe in the Torah, he don't believe in God?
Benjamin Netanyahu is known to be a secular Jew, but he certainly saw the value in being associated with the Rebbe, whose presence is still felt in Israel even 30 years after his death. Sitting alongside his Zionist and ultra-Orthodox allies, Netanyahu may or may not believe in God, but he certainly believes in retribution, visiting violence of biblical proportions upon the people of Gaza.